Okay, let's get into it. Tonight, we are doing something a little different. We're not just doing a deep dive into history. We are, I think, looking for a piece of military history that's been, well, almost hidden in plain sight.
That's a good way to put it.
We're diving into the life and campaigns of a man who just fundamentally reshaped the entire 7th century world. A figure so potent that his victories really ended 2 millennia of imperial dominance. We're talking about Khalid ibn al-Walid, an Arab commander born around 592 AD.
And, let's just start with a statement that might ruffle some feathers right out of the gate, but one I think is absolutely required by the sources we looked at.
Go for it.
Khalid ibn al-Walid belongs in the conversation for one of the 3 greatest military minds of all time. Not just of his era, but of all time.
That is a colossal claim. And honestly, that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive. My mind, it immediately jumps to the historical pantheon the West holds. So, dear Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, maybe Hannibal? These are the men whose tactical innovations we study relentlessly. So, why does the research elevate Khalid, a figure who's relatively unknown outside of specialized military history circles? Why put him on that same pedestal?
It's not just about the number of battles he won, which is essentially every single battle he commanded in full. It's the sheer impossibility of his victories, the logistical coordination, the scale of the enemies he faced.
Okay.
And to really grasp that claim, we have to recognize what he was up against. So our mission today is to step back and look at the geopolitical chessboard he inherited. This is a story of military genius, yes, but it's more profoundly a story of exhaustion.
Exhaustion.
The utter systemic collapse of the 2 ancient superpowers he faced, the Roman and the Persian empires.
So the initial takeaway is clear then. Khalid's astonishing success wasn't just his own skill, but it was because the very foundation of the world he was fighting in was already cracking.
It is cracking, yeah. He showed up at the exact historical moment when 2,100 years of combined imperial power had, for all intents and purposes, ground itself into dust.
Right, which brings us to the context of the age. Because to understand the 7th century, you have to sort of unlearn how we're taught to think about history itself.
If we're going to get this right, we have to start by addressing a bias that, frankly, permeates modern historical teaching, especially in Western universities. It's a systemic flaw in how history is structured.
I found the source's critique of this proximity bias absolutely devastating. It's the subconscious assumption that the history closest to us in time must inherently be the most important.
Exactly that. I mean, look at a typical university syllabus. You might spend a mere 16 weeks rushing through 5,000 years of history.
Everything from Sumer to, say, the Renaissance.
Right. And then you spend the next 16 weeks dwelling on the last 350 years, maybe from the 17th century forward. This structure suggests that the recent past is exponentially more significant.
Which is just demonstrably false when you look at foundational legacies, right?
Yeah, completely false. We often focus on recent events because, sure, the documentation is better or the names feel more familiar. But you have to ask yourself, what shaped the legal structures, the governance, the political traditions of the entire world more profoundly?
The sources offered that really potent comparison, a 19th century British defeat in Afghanistan versus the Battle of Actium in 31 BC.
And Actium is arguably orders of magnitude more important. That one battle formalized the shift from the Roman Republic to the Empire. It set the precedent for autocratic rule, it defined the entire Mediterranean world for centuries, and it cemented legal and political traditions that still underpin Western systems today.
A tactical military defeat 100 years ago, however dramatic, just doesn't carry that same foundational weight.
Not even close. Proximity bias really blinds us to the long-term impact of foundational history.
But the critique from the sources goes deeper than just pacing, doesn't it? By focusing so heavily on Greece, Rome, and then jumping immediately to early modern Europe, you create a narrative.
You do. You create a narrative that attempts to claim ownership of Western civilization by European scholars. French, British, English.
It creates a story that's sort of divorced from reality.
It is. Western civilization, as the historical curriculum itself admits, began in Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq and Egypt. The founders were the people of the Near East. The narrative then awkwardly tries to pretend that this civilization, its philosophy, its engineering, its culture, just packed up and fled permanently to Italy and England.
Right, as if it stopped all innovation in its original birthplace.
Which is just preposterous. Civilization, it's like a river. It can split into branches, but the source continues to flow and evolve. The version of civilization that continued and grew in the Middle East during the 7th century just evolved differently than the European branch.
And this brings us right to that common misconception of the medieval period, or the Dark Age. The term implies this blanket global collapse. The misconception is that the Dark Age happened everywhere, or maybe more insidiously, that the Middle East somehow sank into a greater barbarism than Europe.
And we even demonstrate that bias geographically by renaming the birthplace of Western civilization Mesopotamia and the Levant the Middle East as if it's just some incidental location rather than the heart of ancient power.
Let's ground this comparison in reality for a minute. Put yourself in 7th century Europe. What did that look like?
The sources detail a pretty grim lifestyle, talking unpaved roads, extremely poor hygiene, a short life expectancy hovering around 40 years if you were very lucky.
And the famous chamber pots.
And infamously, yes, waste disposal often meant emptying a chamber pot out of an upper window directly onto the street below. Disease was rampant, life was brutal, and intellectual progress had largely stalled.
It sounds utterly miserable. Now, what was life like in the sophisticated cities that Khalid was marching towards, cities like Damascus, Antioch, and the Persian capital, Ctesiphon?
The contrast is just startling. These cities had complex urban planning that had been maintained for centuries. They had systems of indoor plumbing. And I don't just mean a bucket.
Right.
I mean pipes bringing fresh, potable water in and critically dedicated sewage systems taking waste out. Their city streets were paved, and they were often illuminated at night with oil lamps.
A level of infrastructure that European cities wouldn't rediscover for nearly 1,000 years.
That's right. So we really need to jettison this image of the Arab world in the 7th century as some kind of primitive backwater. Khalid was not operating in a cultural vacuum. He was operating in a technologically advanced region that had just been utterly hollowed out by centuries of conflict.
Precisely. His world was sophisticated but strategically dying. And that death was caused by the very powers he was about to defeat.
The two-headed dragon, as the sources call it, Rome and Persia.
So the stage is set by these two great empires. And we have to establish that Roman vulnerability wasn't new, it was ancient. We can start with the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, which really demonstrated that Roman military dominance was fundamentally flawed against certain Persian tactics.
Carrhae wasn't just a military defeat, it was a political disaster that proved Persia's military technology and strategic thinking were already superior to Rome's in certain key areas.
And the whole thing started with just pure cynical greed.
Absolutely. Marcus Licinius Crassus, he was part of that secret triumvirate with Pompey and Caesar. He saw Caesar making an absolute fortune plundering Gaul and decided he wanted the same wealth and glory. So he, as the governor of Syria, launched an illegal war into the Persian Empire for sheer personal gain.
And Crassus had reason to be confident, right? I mean, he marched with 40,000 Romans. The backbone of that was 32,000 disciplined, heavy infantry legionaries.
The finest fighting force the world had ever known at that point.
He's facing only 8,000 Persian cavalry, mostly horse archers. On paper, it was a rout waiting to happen for the Romans.
The initial engagement seemed to confirm Crassus's arrogance. When the Persian archers rode up and started firing, the Romans did what they always did. They locked into the famed testudo formation.
The turtle shell of interlocking shields.
Exactly. And the arrows just clattered harmlessly off the steel and bronze. Crassus must have been mentally calculating his plunder, thinking these lightly equipped Persians would just run out of arrows and flee.
But the sources reveal two tactical innovations that the Romans were completely, utterly unprepared for. First, the Parthian shot.
Yes. The Persians would pretend to retreat, drawing the impatient Romans out of their protective testudo and into a chase. And then, while at a full gallop, riding away, the horse archers would twist completely around in their saddles and fire accurately backwards.
The Romans had never seen this.
Never. They couldn't reform the testudo fast enough, and the arrows, now hitting isolated men, caused mass casualties and shattered their morale.
So the Roman lines are disorganized, they're confused, and they're taking heavy losses from an enemy they can't even pin down. And that's when the Persians unveiled their technological ace.
The cataphracts arrived. We're talking about 1,000 fully armored soldiers riding fully armored horses. You have to understand the psychological impact here.
It's like an ancient tank on the battlefield.
That's the perfect analogy. They were armored juggernauts.
The sources note this heavy cavalry technology was a staggering 14 centuries ahead of what Europe would develop later. When they hit those fragmented Roman lines, they were unstoppable. They cut through them like a hot knife through butter.
A heavy metal wave just crashing into disorganized infantry. The Romans had no effective counter for that kind of force multiplier.
None. And Crassus's logistical mistake about the ammunition is still just breathtaking in its
He
hubris.
just assumed they'd run out.
He fundamentally misunderstood his enemy's resource management. Waiting for the enemy to run out of ammo only works if their logistics are as rudimentary as yours. The Persians, far from having a few quivers on their backs, brought 1,000 camels. 1,000 camels.
Each camel was loaded with 1,000 arrows.
That's 1,000,000 arrows.
1,000,000 arrows in reserve. They had, for all practical purposes, an unlimited supply of death to hurl at the Romans.
The outcome was just total annihilation. 20,000 Romans killed, 10,000 captured, a kill ratio estimated at something like 100 to 1.
And the grim, symbolic execution of Crassus pouring molten gold down his throat, that act launched 700 years of continuous existential warfare between Rome and Persia.
And that's 700 years of fighting not just border skirmishes, but frequent massive wars. That's the grinding background noise that ensures that by the 6th century AD, both empires are just running on fumes.
They were not only militarily exhausted, but facing systemic collapse, driven by factors far outside the battlefield.
Okay, let's talk about the biological and environmental factors, because this is where the history becomes shockingly modern. We're talking about environmental change, globalization, and public health collapse.
What's fascinating is the interconnectedness of ecology and empire. The sources point to Indonesian fishermen who, through incredible feats of seamanship, island hopped all the way across the Indian Ocean and established colonies on Madagascar. And there they began cultivating rice.
And rice cultivation, a seemingly benign agricultural development, proved to be a geopolitical tipping point.
It was deadly. The practice spread across Africa, into Egypt, throughout Mesopotamia, and eventually it reached southern Europe. Now, to grow rice, you have to flood the fields.
Right.
And flooded fields create the perfect, permanent breeding ground for the Anopheles mosquito, the carrier of malaria. So malaria, which had previously been localized, became endemic across the entire region, from Spain all the way to Iran.
So this is basically a 7th century lesson in how interconnected public health crises and globalization were, even before we had a word for it.
That's exactly what it is. And the demographic consequence of this sudden, massive introduction of chronic malaria, it was catastrophic.
How bad was it?
Well, populations across both empires plunged. But maybe more telling was the drop in quality of life and sheer longevity. Life expectancy, which had been a relatively healthy 40 to 45 years in the Roman world, plummeted to the mid-20s.
The mid-20s, that just decimates your society.
It does. It reduces the available manpower for farms, for armies, for tax collection. It fundamentally slashes Rome's and Persia's economic and military capacity.
So they're already weakened, smaller populations, smaller armies, poor economies. And then, in the mid-6th century, nature delivers the knockout blow.
The Justinian plague, the first known outbreak of the bubonic plague.
And this plague just tore apart the foundations of society that malaria had already weakened.
It did. And it's a sobering reminder of the cyclical nature of disease. The sources point out that this plague seems to have operated on roughly an 800-year cycle.
We all remember the Black Death of 1348, which killed 40% of Europe.
The Justinian plague was just as brutal. In the Middle East and North Africa, the death rate may have been even higher than the later medieval outbreaks. Yeah. We're talking up to 60% of the population in some urban centers in a single year.
60%? I can't even imagine that. A thriving city losing over half its people in a few months, the institutional memory, the agricultural knowledge, the craft skills, all just gone.
Exactly. So if we connect this back to the 7th century, by the time Khalid shows up, both the Roman and Persian empires are shells of their former imperial glory. They're politically fractured, economically ruined, and demographically depleted.
And yet they had one final, utterly draining, self-destructive hurrah, the final war from 602 to 628 AD.
Mm-hmm.
And the sources reveal this started not over some grand geopolitical strategy, but a personal vendetta.
It's incredible, isn't it? The Roman Emperor Maurice was murdered by a usurping general named Phocas. Well, Maurice happened to be a close personal friend of the Persian Emperor Casagranda II, who then declared war to avenge his friend and restore the dynasty.
This 26-year conflict became a total war, consuming every last reserve of manpower and wealth that the plagues and malaria had left them.
It was so brutal that even after Khosrow was defeated by the heroic Roman Emperor Heraclius, the damage was done. At one point, a Persian general named Sharbaraz was so successful, he carved off a huge functioning chunk of the Roman Empire, from Egypt all the way to Armenia, and ruled it as his own independent state.
So the war finally grinds to an exhausted halt in 628 AD, and that's just 4 years before the death of the Prophet Muhammad and the launch of the massive Arab conquests.
The timing is crucial. The ultimate result of this centuries-long rivalry was not victory for either side, but the total mutual suicidal exhaustion of the world's two military superpowers. The political vacuum was absolute.
Which is the exact moment Khalid steps onto the world stage.
We need to place Khalid into this exact timeline, yes. He was born in 592 AD. The political engine he would later serve, Islam, was founded in 610 AD when Muhammad received prophecy in Mecca, followed by the pivotal migration, the Hijra, to Medina in 622.
What I find truly fascinating is that Khalid was not a founder. He was initially a fierce opponent of the early Muslim community. He was a seasoned military man fighting for the Meccan establishment.
He was a professional soldier who knew how to win. He was responsible for a major defeat of the early Muslims at the Battle of Uhud in 625 AD. He was also a commander at the Siege of Medina during the Battle of the Trench in 627. So, he spent his early career mastering warfare by fighting against the very forces he would eventually lead.
And he converts relatively late, within 2 years of the Battle of the Trench, so around 629 AD. And his very first command as a Muslim general is not some glorious charge. It's a rescue mission following a total disaster.
So the Battle of Mu'tah.
Right.
Mu'tah is the first real look at Khalid's mind under extreme duress. A force of 3,000 Muslim Arabs marched north, seemingly unaware of the strength they were about to encounter from the Roman Empire. They met a Roman force, largely Christian Arab auxiliaries backed by legions, estimated between 10,000 and 20,000 men.
That's being outnumbered 3-1, potentially up to 7-1. And the fighting was brutal.
The Arab force was virtually annihilated. Commander after commander fell in quick succession. They were being systematically beaten, routed, and destroyed.
And the remaining leaders, in desperation, they just hand the banner to the newly converted Khalid.
Essentially saying, the battle is lost, but save the army if you can. The mission instantly changed from victory to survival.
And Khalid pulled off what the sources describe as the impossible rescue, a masterpiece of strategic extraction relying entirely on psychological warfare.
Let's break down the deception, because it's absolutely brilliant and shows his deep understanding of battlefield psychology. The Romans knew they were crushing a small force. Khalid needed to convince them that that calculation had completely changed.
So he uses the terrain and the cover of darkness.
He does. He took the exact same men and overnight ordered them to sneak around a hill mass and approach from a different direction at dawn, carrying different banners than the day before.
So, to the Romans watching from their position, it looked like a massive, fresh column of reinforcements had arrived.
Exactly, a fresh army to relieve the beaten one. The Romans stopped their attack, momentarily paralyzed by this unexpected influx of troops.
And then he does it again.
He repeats the maneuver. He secretly switches the banners again, sends the men back around, and they reappear with a third set of banners, creating the illusion of unending, fresh reinforcements just pouring onto the field. The Roman general must have been panicking, thinking they had just drawn the entire Arabian Peninsula into the fight.
And he doubled down on the visual deception at night.
He did. He ordered every single man to set 5 to 10 campfires, multiplying the appearance of the bivouac size. But the crucial detail was keeping men constantly walking around in front of those campfires all night long.
So the Roman scouts wouldn't just see a vast number of lights.
They would see the shadows of thousands of men milling restlessly about, reinforcing this terrifying image of a gigantic, reinforced and aggressive army just waiting to attack at dawn.
The Romans were paralyzed by fear and confusion. They never attacked.
They didn't. They thought they were walking into a massive, organized trap set by these fresh phantom reinforcements. And that gave Khalid the cover he needed. He stabilized the routed forces, organized them, and managed an orderly retreat back to Medina.
The significance of Mu'tah is profound then. It was the only battle Khalid commanded where he didn't achieve an outright victory.
But he rescued the entire force from total destruction under utterly impossible odds. It was a failure of initial strategy, yes, but a dazzling masterpiece of tactical extraction that guaranteed the survival of the nascent Muslim army.
So the stage for Khalid's true conquering begins in 632 AD with the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Abu Bakr takes the mantle, choosing the title Caliph, meaning follower of the messenger of God.
And Abu Bakr's challenge was immediate and existential, just holding together the various tribes Muhammad had convinced to join him. This led to the Ridda Wars, or the Wars of Apostasy.
And this is a critical point we have to stress. Arabia had never been unified under a single political entity before this moment. Not by the Romans, not by the Persians, not by the Arabs themselves. It was just a collection of fiercely independent tribes.
Exactly. After Muhammad's death, many tribes believed their political allegiance was personal to him, not institutional, and they tried to break away. So Abu Bakr needed a decisive, ruthless, and rapid military leader to enforce unity. He chose Khalid.
And he put him in charge of the Eastern Army. So what was the timeline on this truly impossible task of conquering and unifying an entire peninsula against centuries of historical precedent?
Khalid's brilliance shone through his speed and decisiveness. Through a series of rapid, overwhelming victories, he unified the entire Arabian Peninsula in less than a year, by 633 AD.
Less than a year.
Which established a political entity that was instantly stable and ready to project power outward, something nobody, least of all the Romans and Persians, had expected.
Once Arabia was unified, Khalid didn't pause for rest or reorganization. He immediately continued the campaign toward the Euphrates River, launching attacks directly into the heart of the Persian Empire, modern-day Iraq.
And the first major clash against this historic enemy was the Battle of the Chains. Khalid commanded around 18,000 men against a Persian force of 20,000, heirs to the same military tradition that had crushed Crassus.
The Persian general, Horus, used a desperate and extreme tactic, chaining his elite soldiers together. It sounds medieval, but it had a clear military logic.
The logic was twofold, really. Psychologically, it told the Arabs and the Persians themselves that there would be absolutely no retreat. It was a fight to the death.
And tactically.
More importantly, it created an impenetrable barrier against Khalid's reliance on cavalry. A horse cannot charge through a densely packed line of men chained wrist to wrist.
This is a moment where Khalid's confidence as a leader is on full display. The opening move was traditional. An Arab poet tried to convince the Persians to surrender through verse. That failed. Khalid didn't hesitate.
He walked out and declared himself his own champion. He challenged the Persian general, Horus, to a man-to-man duel. Horus, trapped by the rules of honor, had to accept.
End the fight.
It was over in seconds. Khalid, known by then as the Sword of God, killed the general. So the Persian army now faced a devastating cavalry charge without its commander or its spiritual center.
And Khalid then weaponized the very tactic the Persians had used for their protection.
The chains became a liability. Khalid used his light cavalry to continuously harass the front lines, keeping the chain formations disorganized and off balance. Because they couldn't maneuver or retreat, their cohesion eventually broke down into panic.
And then he swung the cavalry around.
Exactly. Swing them around, tearing into the flanks and the back of the immobilized chain formations. The result was a rout most of the 20,000 Persians killed or captured, with only a couple hundred Muslim losses.
That victory cleared the path into Iraq. But the real high point of his military genius, the feat that truly justifies the claim of him being one of the greatest ever, came next. The logistical masterstroke known as the Triple Convergence.
This is often cited as the greatest non-combat logistical feat of the early medieval period. Khalid had 15,000 men remaining. Ahead of him were 3 separate Persian armies, each 20,000 strong. A total of 60,000 men.
So if they merged, he faced insurmountable 4-to-1 odds. He had to strike them sequentially.
Right. But striking sequentially means covering vast distances in a short time and coordinating perfectly in a pre-technological era.
It required a precision that, honestly, contemporary militaries would struggle to replicate even with GPS, synchronized watches, satellite mapping, and radio communication.
They had none of that. They relied on terrain knowledge, the position of the sun and stars, and just rigorous discipline.
So tell us about the plan.
Khalid took his 15,000 men and cut them into 3 equal 5,000-man units. He gave them 3 separate, long, arduous routes through the desert. His order was meticulous. Converge at a specific point on a specific day, 2 weeks later, at exactly 2:00 a.m.
Okay, I want you, the listener, to just pause and visualize this. Imagine getting 3 groups of 5,000 people spread out across hundreds of miles of unmarked desert, traveling in total silence at night with no means of communication, and having them arrive at the same tiny location at the exact same minute.
It's almost unbelievable, but they did it. All 3 5,000-man units arrived simultaneously at the correct location, catching the first 20,000-man Persian unit sleeping in their camp.
The element of surprise was absolute.
Total. The Persian unit was wiped out with almost 0 losses to the Arabs.
And here's the kicker. He didn't let them rest. He did it again.
Immediately. He ordered the 3 units back out on 3 separate routes, gave the next rendezvous point and the exact date and time, and they converged perfectly a second time, destroying the second 20,000-man unit.
A stunning demonstration of planning, trust, and execution.
And a third time, they converged perfectly, wiping out the final 20,000 men. So in a matter of weeks, 15,000 Arabs had effectively neutralized 60,000 elite Persian troops through logistical and administrative genius.
The result was equally astonishing. Khalid had captured the entirety of Iraq in a single year, a territory the Romans had spent centuries failing to conquer.
And Khalid's conquest of Iraq was so rapid and overwhelming that it achieved the unimaginable. It ended 680 years of ingrained hatred between the Roman and Persian empires.
They finally looked at this new Arab entity and realized the threat was existential. It was greater than their historic rivalry. The Persians, an empire for 1,200 years, and the Romans for 900 years, they combined forces.
This alliance led directly to the Battle of Firaz in 634 AD. This was the largest concentration of power Khalid would ever face. A combined Roman and Persian army, significantly bolstered by Christian Arab auxiliaries.
And we must pause on that point. The term Christian Arab cannot be passed over as a mere footnote. This wasn't just Rome versus Arabia.
No, this was cousin versus cousin. Arab fighting Arab. It highlights the political tragedy of the moment, the deep loyalty the Roman Empire still commanded among the native Christian populations of the Levant.
Absolutely. It was a massive internal schism. This enormous allied force totaled 150,000 men, positioned against Khalid's 15,000 Muslim Arabs.
That is a staggering 10-to-1 disadvantage.
Khalid arrived on the east bank of the Euphrates, with the enemy on the west bank. He needed them to cross to fight on his terms, so he strategically backed his small army away from the river. He created a psychological invitation.
He backed up and split his 15,000 men into 3 5,000-man units, one upriver, one downriver, and one pulled back from the main ford. This placement screamed, "We are weaker, disorganized, and inviting you to cross."
And before the battle began, Khalid made a profound personal commitment, almost a prophecy of his own death.
He prayed. He promised God that if they won, he would perform the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. This wasn't the prayer of a confident general. It was the bargain of a warrior who fully expected to die in combat against such impossible odds.
But once about 50,000 enemy troops had crossed the Euphrates Bridge and ford, Khalid sprung the trap.
He gave the signal. The units upriver and downriver charged along the banks to seize the bridge and the ford, effectively cutting off any avenue of retreat. The 50,000 men who had crossed were trapped against the river.
And then Khalid unleashed his central 5,000 unit, employing the famous compression maneuver.
He used a charge and retreat tactic repeatedly. He never committed to a full final charge, but constantly pressed and backed up.
So every time his cavalry charged and withdrew, it compacted the 50,000 enemy soldiers slightly more toward the center.
He repeated this until the enemy was so tightly compressed they couldn't physically swing their weapons or shields effectively. They realized they were defenseless, and the 50,000 men broke into a full panic, stampeding back toward the river and the cut-off bridge.
The carnage was unthinkable. The Muslim Arabs essentially killed the fleeing soldiers as they ran into the water or into their own trapped men.
The losses: 50,000 Roman and Persian dead versus a mere 200 Muslim dead. An impossible scale of victory. It must have changed Khalid entirely.
It did, and true to his pledge, he had to perform the Hajj. But he knew his caliph, Abu Bakr, would never allow his most valuable general to travel hundreds of miles away during a war.
So Khalid ordered his main army to march back to their base in Hira, then secretly took his fastest horses and the few trusted men. He raced across the desert, got to Mecca, put on a hood so no one would recognize it.
A legendary general, right?
Performed the Hajj rituals in record time and raced back, rejoining his marching army as if he had never left.
He returned to command, only to have a messenger from the caliph arrive a few days later. Abu Bakr had clearly been tipped off by a spotter in Mecca with a stern warning, "Don't ever do that again."
The focus then shifted west toward the Roman heartland in Syria. Khalid was ordered to invade, which required another immense logistical feat, crossing a notorious waterless desert to reach Damascus, a move that Heraclius' commanders thought impossible.
But during this campaign, the political tides shifted. Caliph Abu Bakr died, and Khalid's first cousin, Omar, became the new caliph. And Omar had a very different view of Khalid.
Omar, a man of profound political discipline and humility, was deeply concerned by Khalid's rock star status. The general was beloved, popular, successful, and success breeds political ambition.
He feared Khalid might eventually stage a coup or overshadow the caliphate itself.
Exactly. So Omar immediately demoted him. Khalid was to remain a general but was removed from overall command of the armies facing the massive Roman counterattack.
This counterattack was Rome's final gasp. Emperor Heraclius mobilized 4 massive armies in 4 separate locations, intending to defeat the fragmented Arab units piecemeal. But the Arab commanders, faced with overwhelming force, held an emergency conference.
The official leader, Abu Ubaidah, stood up and asked the other generals, "Who among us is the best man to lead us to victory?" The answer was unanimous. They unofficially promoted Khalid back to overall command for the decisive clash, consolidating their forces near the plain of Yarmouk.
The Battle of Yarmouk in 636 AD. This was the end of the Roman Empire in the Levant. Khalid faced Vahan, the Roman commander, with 40,000 Muslim Arabs against an estimated 120,000 Roman and Armenian troops. Still 3-to-1 odds.
And Khalid used the terrain masterfully. He positioned his army so the steep ravine of Yarmouk covered their southern flank, preventing the massive Roman army from executing an easy flanking maneuver. Vahan, the Roman general, positioned his army between the Muslims and a second ravine to the west.
The battle raged for days. On day 2, Vahan launched a massive coordinated assault that caused both Muslim flanks to buckle and collapse, resulting in a full retreat. It looked like the battle was lost.
And here we find one of the most incredible human interest stories in the sources, the intervention of the women. The women served in crucial support roles, providing water, tending to the wounded, but also acting as the final line of resistance.
And as the men retreated,
The women grabbed tent posts and physically formed a line, beating their own men and pushing them back into the fight.
they literally shamed them back into combat, shouting, "You've shamed your wife!"
And this moral and physical pressure worked. The retreating men turned around, stabilized the line, and pushed Vahan's forces back to their starting positions. Vahan was utterly blown away. He had broken the army, and yet the women forced it to rally.
For days 3, 4, and 5, Vahan kept pushing, trying to smash that recalcitrant Muslim right flank.
But Khalid, constantly anticipating and responding, kept using his superior cavalry to stabilize every collapsing position. The battle became a bloody stalemate.
Sensing Vahan's desperation, on day 5, the Roman general attempted to sue for terms, a compromise.
Khalid famously refused to even talk, saying, "The Romans only talk when they are losing." He knew Vahan was exhausted and desperate. Then, on day 6, Khalid deployed his final decisive maneuver.
The ultimate cavalry charge.
He took all 8,000 of his available cavalry and executed a sweeping, powerful swing against the Roman left flank. But the preparatory step was genius. Overnight, he had snuck 500 cavalry around to capture the bridge over the western ravine.
So when the main cavalry charge shattered the Roman flank, the massive 120,000-man army had nowhere to run. They were trapped against the steep ravines.
The result was total disarray. The sheer number of men was compressed and routed into the ravines, leading to a catastrophic collapse of Roman authority in the region.
And Khalid, ever the professional, pursued the defeated General Vahan outside Damascus.
Challenged him to a final duel, killed him, and completed the conquest of Syria. Emperor Heraclius, watching the disaster unfold from afar, withdrew, reportedly declaring, "Farewell, Syria."
After Yarmouk and the fall of Damascus, the Arab army headed toward Jerusalem, a city holy to all 3 Abrahamic faiths. The military had abandoned it, but the Archbishop Sophronius refused to surrender to anyone but the Caliph himself.
Right. The Arab generals, knowing the distance and the danger of bringing the Caliph to the battlefield, tried to trick Sophronius by having Khalid impersonate Omar. They were first cousins and bore a resemblance. But Sophronius was tipped off. Negotiations broke down, and Omar had to travel from Mecca to accept the surrender.
And the arrival of Caliph Omar in Jerusalem provides one of the most powerful and important contrasts in political history, a moment of profound visual storytelling.
It really is. Sophronius, a Christian Arab and loyal Roman citizen, approached the riding army with maximum ostentation.
The description paints a vivid picture. Sophronius was clad in rich red robes, gold tassels perfumed, and carried on a lectica, a couch borne by servants and fanned by 2 men. He was the embodiment of Roman Christian imperial pomp.
He approached the dusty Arab camp and asked the man leading the army, "Where is the Caliph?"
And the man on the camel nods to the man leading the camel, who is dressed in mended rags, his clothes patched multiple times, covered in dust from the journey.
Sophronius is utterly shocked. He asks Omar, "How can you be so poor? You have just conquered the wealthiest provinces of the Roman and Persian empires." And Omar, radiating this profound humility, replied simply that they were not fighting for plunder or gold, but for faith, and that his needs were humble.
And when asked why he was walking while his servant rode the camel,
Omar explained that they shared the ride, taking turns so neither would become exhausted.
Sophronius, a man of the cloth and a Roman dignitary, was reportedly shamed right off his elaborate couch by the caliph's genuine humility. They walked together to the city gates, and Omar offered terms of surrender that were completely unprecedented in centuries of Roman conquest protocols.
The terms were astonishingly generous. They set a completely new standard for imperial conquest. All Roman politicians, military officers, and top bureaucrats had to leave, but they could take anything they could physically carry. Gold, treasure, anything.
And crucially,
There was to be absolutely no plundering of the city, no seizure of property, no rape, and no enslavement of the conquered population.
Sophronius, accustomed to Roman conquest, which included all of those things, was stunned by the restraint. Omar insisted they would leave the city exactly as they found it, only ejecting the political and military establishment. Sophronius immediately surrendered.
And as they walked the city streets, Sophronius was so impressed by Omar's character that he invited him to perform his Muslim prayer inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a gesture of religious kinship and unity.
And Omar refused. This is another crucial act of humility and astonishing political foresight.
He refused because he recognized the political reality. He told Sophronius, "I am the caliph. The first place I perform the prayer in Jerusalem will become a mosque. I do not want you to lose your church."
Instead, they found an empty lot of unclaimed land and prayed side by side. The caliph in his Muslim tradition, the archbishop in his Christian tradition.
And that empty lot is today a mosque, a monument to that moment of tolerance.
After the surrender, Omar insisted on visiting the Temple Mount, the holiest site in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And Sophronius' revelation there is deeply disturbing and provides a shocking insight into the intolerance of the preceding Roman regime.
Sophronius revealed that after the Romans tore down the Second Temple of Solomon centuries earlier, the subsequent Christian rulers had been using the sacred area of the Temple Mount as a garbage dump for 500 years. A continuous, deliberate act of desecration intended to punish the Jewish population.
And Omar, confronted by this profound act of disrespect toward a holy site, didn't delegate the task. He fell to his knees and began clearing the refuse by hand. His army immediately followed suit.
And then came the final, extraordinary act of tolerance and governance. Omar learned that the Christians in the city had recently murdered 20,000 Jews and purged the city of its remaining Jewish population. He declared this act wrong and unjust.
He didn't just accept the purge, he mandated that a Jewish presence be reestablished in the city.
He ordered a Jewish convert to Islam to find 80 Jewish families willing to volunteer to move back to Jerusalem. What stands out here is that in that moment, the conqueror was protecting the conquered from the people he had just conquered, ensuring the city's holiness was recognized and maintained for all three Abrahamic groups.
It's an incredible end to the military part of the story.
Khalid's story, though, despite all his triumph, it ends with a tragic note. Despite his military genius, the Caliph Omar, still fearing his immense popularity, political ambition, and the cult of personality surrounding him, forced Khalid into retirement in Mecca.
The sword of God was permanently sheathed. He never fought another battle, spending his final years far from the campaign field. He died in bed at the relatively young age of 50.
His final words are the ultimate lament of a lifelong warrior. He looked at his body, covered in combat wounds and scars from head to toe, and complained bitterly that he was dying like a cow in bed, having wished for the dignity and glory of dying as a man on the field of battle.
So what does this all mean for us? The story of Khalid ibn al-Walid is far more than a military history lesson. It is a history that proves military genius, however ruthless and overwhelming. The ability to win 10-to-1 odds 3 times in a row is most effective when paired with profound political insight and humility.
That's right. The conquest of Syria and Iraq was only stabilized by the conduct demonstrated during the conquest of Jerusalem.
This is the crux of the matter, isn't it? The most shocking revelation in the sources is that the victorious conquerors were not primarily driven by the same motives that fueled the collapse of the Romans and Persians: plunder, gold, and territorial vanity.
They were driven by a sense of religious mission and, critically, backed it up with an unprecedented level of respect and tolerance for the conquered population and their holy sites.
That dramatic difference in conduct, the generous terms, the refusal to pillage, the political humility, was in fact the greatest strategic tool they possessed. It ensured that the new caliphate was seen not just as a replacement empire, but as a preferable, more stable, and more equitable governing power than the exhausted, collapsing regimes it replaced.
And that leads to the final provocative thought we want to leave you with, one to mull over. The ultimate takeaway from this history is that humility and tolerance weren't just morally superior choices for the early caliphate, they were strategically the most effective tools for building a lasting empire.
So if tolerance and justice proved to be better governance tools in the 7th century than imperial greed and vengeance, what does that imply about the long-term effectiveness of the global powers and conflicts we witness today?